Hey there. So, originally, I was planning on doing a retrospective of Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2, similarly to how I did a retrospective on the first one, as my next big comic book themed video essay. But a few days ago, word came out that Kang the Conqueror would be the next Thanos level threat in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And seeing as how I've been wanting to do more comic book themed content as of late, since I'm a huge comic book fan, I feel like this would be a good opportunity to jump right into that. So, what I've done is just getting into it. I've compiled my thoughts and theories as to why Kang is so important. I've have eventual characters that I feel like could be introduced through Kang, and then I just have like a brief explanation of who Kang is. I feel like he is going to lead into an eventual two-part New Avengers movie, but we'll get into that. My name is Noah, and welcome back to, I guess not welcome back, because this is the first episode, but welcome to my unnamed comic book talk show. Doesn't have a name yet, but that might stick. Alright, so for those of you who don't know, on September 14th, Marvel Studios announced that Jonathan Majors would be playing the role of Kang the Conqueror in Ant-Man 3. At first, it was unsure whether or not Kang would be the solo villain of that film. However, it was later specified that he is planned to play a much larger, overarching role, which is good. Kang is a villain that cannot be done justice in a solo movie. Make someone like Eric O'Grady, the third Ant-Man, or MODOK, he'd be good. Make them the villain of Ant-Man 3, and have Kang be the post-credit scene, which I do think that's the route that they're planning on taking, which that's perfect. It's best case scenario. At this point, though, a lot of you may be asking, who exactly is Kang? And to that, dear viewer, it's a bit of a complicated story. Kang made his first appearance in Avengers issue 8 of September 1964. In this first appearance, he kidnapped both Rick Jones and the Wasp, holding them for ransom. Ultimately, he's defeated by the Avengers after Rick Jones pretended to side with Kang before double-crossing him. We didn't really learn much about his character in his first appearance, as he was just more of a villain of the week sort of thing. We really wouldn't flesh out his backstory and his history until a few years later. About that origin story, Kang's origin story can be a bit hard to explain, but the gist of it goes as follows. Nathaniel Richards, that's Kang's true name, was a man from Earth in the 31st century who was intrigued by the history of Earth. He discovers time travel technology that was invented by Victor Von Doom, aka Doctor Doom, who I believed for the longest time was going to be the next MCU villain. But upon acquiring this astounding technology, Nathaniel uses it to travel back in time to ancient Egypt, where he becomes the pharaoh Rama-Tut. Despite this, he is eventually discovered and defeated by none other than the Fantastic Four. After this defeat, Nathaniel attempts to return to the 31st century to take over Earth, but he misses his date by 1,000 years. In this new future Earth, the world has been completely obliterated by war and life is near extinct. Despite all this, Nathaniel sees this as an opportunity. He collects an abundance of weapons and technologies from the future and decides to conquer his future Earth, in which he succeeds in doing. After taking over this Earth, he begins to expand this empire that he's developed across the universe, renaming himself Kang the Conqueror. Kang would go on to use the time travel technology to become a menace not only to his Earth, but to various locations across the multiversal time stream. He's essentially Alexander the Great, but with super advanced weaponry that we don't even have ideas for at this point, and the ability to time travel. Now, when talking about the MCU, it's important to note Kang's real name, which is Nathaniel Richards. If that last name sounds familiar, it should. Kang is the descendant of Reed and Susan Richards, aka Mr. Fantastic and Invisible Woman of Fantastic Four fame. This means that Kang already has one thing he could bring to the table through his introduction, that being the Fantastic Four. A constant point I hear being brought up when discussing the potential of the X-Men and the Fantastic Four being introduced into the Marvel Cinematic Universe is how the movies would explain the absence of characters like Wolverine, Mr. Fantastic, Scott Summers, Cyclops, all those guys during the events of both Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. And to that I say, not many people may know this right now, but Kang is actually a sneaky little way of making a bridge that could potentially connect the Fantastic Four, maybe the X-Men, but not nearly as much, into the main Marvel Universe. What do I mean by that? Well, in this new era of Marvel, it seems that the comics and movies are focusing not just on Earth 616, which is the main Marvel Universe, but they're also taking a look at the multiverse as a whole. And because of this, it's entirely possible to see an origin story where the Fantastic Four are from either a parallel Earth, or what I believe to be a even better idea, that they're from the future of Earth 616. Now, let's play into that a bit. I was speaking with a friend of mine about Kang's addition into the MCU, and he proposed this idea that I really like a lot. This idea in question was that the reason Reed Richards and the rest of the Fantastic Four were absent from the MCU until this given point is because they're from the future. Now, while the idea may seem strange on paper, there are actually a couple ways we can look at it. The first being that the Fantastic Four existed centuries before the birth of Kang, but whatever time period they existed in has yet to pass in the MCU. The issue with this, at least in my opinion, is that if they're in a future without Kang, it doesn't really give them any incentive to go back in time. Sure, you could have someone like, let's say, a nihilist comes from the future, in a future period, so the Fantastic Four come back in time to warn them. And Reed Richards, he's one of the smartest men on the planet, so he could easily build a time machine. I just don't see a way that they could do that without it seeming just like a convenience for them to arrive at the given point in the MCU. So I was thinking about this more and more, and this is where my idea comes in. So I'm going to pitch an after-credit scene for Ant-Man 3, and this is how I would introduce the Fantastic Four into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So picture this. It's the post-credit scene for Ant-Man 3, and it opens to a city on fire. There's no sign of life, motion, and it all seems empty. That is, it seems empty until we cut to the inside of a hallway. This hallway is in a dark building. It might have some of those horror movie aspects where there's flickering lights. And we don't see anyone in this hallway, but we can hear the sound of footsteps running towards the camera. These steps get louder and louder until they reach the end of the hallway, when suddenly these four figures who were invisible prior to now suddenly appear. The room is dark, so it's hard to make out any specific details about these figures, but one is significantly larger than the others. At this point, the four enter the lab at the end of this door, and one of the figures begins to type on a computer in front of a device that seems like some sort of portal. "It's almost done. We've made it just in time," the figure in front of the computer says. "Yeah, but we don't have much longer, Stretch. He'll be here any minute now," says the biggest one. "Please just hurry," a female voice yells in desperation. Right after we hear this, there's a loud explosion that can be heard from coming down the hall that these four came from. "I'll hold him off," the last figure says before running into the hallway. As he leaves, a dim orange light can be seen through the glass panes across the door. "Hothead's gonna get himself killed out there," the big guy says. "Not if I can help it," the one at the computer responds with. As he says this, the portal gate opens, filling the room with a dim blue light. Not much, but just enough to where we can make out who exactly these figures are. The one at the computer is a man in his late 30s. He has several gray hairs, a dirty beard. The woman has blonde hair and looks tired, and the biggest figure, however, is made entirely out of stones. He's wearing a large pair of gym shorts. The bearded man says to his friends, "I've pinpointed the best destination for our escape. Whatever happens, just stay together." Hearing this, the girl and the rock man run through the portal. A loud crash can be heard as the flaming man comes crashing through the windows across the lab. "Johnny, go," the man in the beard tells the once flaming man in a leather jacket. He tries to crawl to the portal, but he's too tired and hurt to crawl. The bearded man runs over, picking him up. As the clicking of footsteps grows louder and louder, the sound of an energy blast is heard as the last two survivors enter the portal, which is then destroyed by the blast. At this point, the camera pans to the one who shot the portal, none other than Conqueror. He shakes his head before throwing his blaster in a fit of rage. His targets escaped. The blaster he threw hits a pair of glasses on a desk, shattering them. The final scene of this sequence is the desk that the glasses were on. As the camera focuses in on the name tag, it reads Dr. Reed Richards, and with that, the credits roll. This scene establishes what I believe would be the best way to introduce both the Fantastic Four and Kang in a single scene. They aren't just some random time travelers from the future, but rather they're refugees from a future that has been destroyed by Kang. They are traveling back in time to a point where they know they can find help in the era of superheroes. And with that, I feel like I've explained enough how Kang introduces the Fantastic Four. That being said, there is another superhero team that is closely intertwined with Kang, as well as having a lot of characters that already exist in the MCU to some extent. With that, let's talk about the Young Avengers. Now, the Young Avengers have had several different lineups ever since their introduction in 2005. That being said, the lineup I want to focus on is the original team, which consisted of Iron Lad, Patriot, Wiccan, Speed, Stature, and Hawkeye. The Hawkeye mentioned is not to be confused with Clint Barton. Normally I would specify, but seeing as how the MCU seems to have made Clint have the full transition into Ronin, I'm pretty sure that a spot for a new character named Hawkeye is open. While I'm sure most of you have never even heard of these characters, these kids are one of the biggest additions Kang would bring to the table. The best part, unlike the Fantastic Four, all of the characters already have key ties to the pre-existing MCU. These would make them easy to introduce if they were planning on it. I want to go over each member of the team since they aren't well known by casual moviegoers or fans that don't look into the more niche characters. But before we get into that, I probably should explain why the Young Avengers are so important to the story of Kang. As stated earlier, the Young Avengers were introduced in 2005, in the title of the same name. This story followed the team coming together after being warned by a young man from the future, who we will get into later, that Kang will take over the Earth if they're unable to stop him. The reason why the main Avengers weren't able to do this at the time is because they were still recovering from the Avengers Disassembled event. For those of you who don't know, Avengers Disassembled is the story where a zombified Jack of Hearts returns to Earth, causing an explosion that kills Scott Lang and destroys half the Avengers Mansion. There's more to it than that, but that's just the short version. Now, to sidetrack for a second, for those of you who don't know, I'll give you the short version. King of Hearts is this super interesting superhero, in my opinion. He might be in a Guardians of the Galaxy movie at some point, but most likely not. Essentially, he's this young man who's half human, half Contraxian. His father built this chemical called Zero Fluid, and young Jack was doused in it accidentally. This gave him superpowers, but the issue was Jack couldn't control these powers, so he had to wear a containment suit all the time. He joined the Avengers and had a reoccurring rivalry with Scott Lang, which eventually ended in Jack rescuing his daughter from being kidnapped. He drugged the kidnapper into space when his containment suit got ripped, and he was presumed dead. Later, he returns as a zombified state. The Zero Fluid would not let him die. He comes back to Earth, causes the explosion. That leads into Avengers Disassembled. That's kind of a tangent, but I just really like him as a character, so I felt like that was kind of an interesting thing to go into. So yeah, he's a super interesting character that I don't feel like gets the attention he deserves. Yeah. But going back to the Young Avengers, this unnamed kid who comes from the future assembles this team of young superheroes to stand in for the regular Avengers in their absence. Now, it's eventually revealed that this young boy from the future is actually a younger Nathaniel Richards. This means that he is destined to grow up to become Kang, which presents an interesting dynamic for the young heroes. Do they trust their new ally, Iron Lad, or do they turn against him now knowing that he is destined to become Kang? Overall, the Young Avengers aren't the most influential characters in their own right, but I feel like if you want to do Kang justice, the Young Avengers are a necessity to have in the MCU. On top of that, looking at the future of the MCU, I am almost certainly willing to bet that we will receive a Young Avengers movie or even television show at some point in the near future. This show might introduce all the characters, but rather I feel like these characters will be introduced through various movies. And there's actually some evidence to support this. While I should start with Iron Lad, as he's the quote-unquote team leader, I do want to save him for last because I have the most to say and speculate about him. Rather, I'd like to start with Eli Bradley. So, Eli Bradley is the grandson of the scientist who invented Captain America's super soldier serum, and as a result, he is the Captain America stand-in for the team. He would be extremely easy to introduce, considering his grandfather's already a character that exists in the MCU and Captain America lore, and it's, all they would have to do to introduce him is maybe put him in an upcoming project like, I don't know, the Winter Soldier and Falcon television show. I could definitely see that show having some sort of mention of a kid named Eli Bradley. Like, from the trailers, there's some football game that they're in or something. What if it's like a high school football game and Eli Bradley is like this super athletic kid who maybe he hasn't taken the serum yet, but he's like the star quarterback, and most like their best player. That way you get the character already intertwined into the universe. So I feel like he's one of the easiest characters to introduce. And following up with them, we have Wiccan and Speed. Now these two are also super easy to introduce. And they're also really interesting characters in their own right, as they're the magical born children of Vision and the Scarlet Witch. This is important because it has all but been confirmed that in the upcoming WandaVision television show, the twins, because Wiccan and Speed, they're twins, they're going to make some sort of appearance in this show. Wiccan is interesting because he's supposed to be the Thor stand-in for the team, but his powers more resemble Scarlet Witch, so he kind of is a 2-for-1 inclusion. He's kind of a mixture of the two. His brother Speed, however, is a lot more straightforward. He's almost exactly like his uncle Pietro. Most people know him as Quicksilver. He is what I believe maybe tied with Captain Marvel to be the most wasted character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So, wrapping up the trend of young Avengers who would be introduced through TV shows, we have Kate Bishop Hawkeye. Unlike Wiccan, Patriot, and Speed, it's actually been confirmed that Kate Bishop will make an appearance, most likely as a main character in the upcoming Hawkeye show. This is most likely because the show is based on the 2012 Matt Fraction run of Hawkeye. This run focused on the passing of the torch from a now-deaf Clint Barton to his apprentice Kate Bishop. Out of all the Young Avengers, I would argue that Kate is the one with the most lasting impact, as she has become a core member of the main Avengers lineup even till today. Just looking at the TV shows, I mean, we found loose ends that could lead to the introduction of 4 out of the 7 Young Avengers. So with that, let's get into the last 3, those being Hulkling, Stature, and Iron Lad. So, going off of name alone, most people would assume that Hulkling is the Young Avengers equivalent of Bruce Banner, but actually he's more of a parallel to Captain Marvel. Not the original, not Carol Danvers. He's a Skrull-Kree hybrid who came to Earth in peace, and there's honestly not a lot to him. He can shapeshift, and he has super strength. He can essentially do anything a Skrull and a Kree can. He's like a warrior hybrid. And he's the one that, him and Patriot are probably the two that have the least amount of evidence for them being in there. Hulkling is actually probably the one with the least evidence, because the only thing going for him right now is that we just introduced the Skrull and the Kree. So, honestly, in Captain Marvel 2, you could just have some character named Klurt, his name's like Klurt or something, it's like KLRT, and there you go. I mean, just bring him back to Earth at some point, and he can become Hulkling. The next Avenger actually got me considering Young Avengers as an MCU possibility before Kang was even announced. There are just too many things that line up, and this Avenger would be Stature. Now, for those of you wondering why I'm so confident about this character being the biggest hint to a Young Avengers movie, Stature is a character that already exists in the MCU, and one that conveniently aged up in the gap between Infinity War and Endgame. The survival of Cassie Lang through the Thanos snap gives me reason to believe that she will eventually play the role of Stature, or Stinger, which is the action figure I have here. It's her as Wasp, essentially, in the MCU. Now, Stature has all the same powers as Ant-Man and Giant Man, as she used the Pym particles to become a hero after her father was seemingly killed by Jack of Hearts in the Avengers Disassembled event, as we stated earlier. So, next up, and lastly, we have Iron Lad, and I saved this guy for last for a really good reason. While we don't have any actual clues for Iron Lad's existence in the MCU other than us now knowing that Kang exists, there is one character who I believe could easily take on the role of Iron Lad. The character being Harley Keener, the kid from Iron Man 3. Now, before I get too deep into the idea, I just want to clarify that this is my personal idea. If the MCU wants to introduce Nathaniel Richards from the future, I'm all for it. This is just my personal pitch for the MCU's take on Iron Lad. So there's a lot of reasoning as to why I believe there's a good chance that Harley Keener will eventually take on the mantle of Iron Lad. For starters, let's look at Harley's character. Harley is a child prodigy who's very intelligent for his age. He also has noticeable lack of a father figure, and it's brought up multiple times in the film that that he is experiencing copious amounts of bullying. Now, let's take a look at Iron Lad. He is a young child with an extremely intelligent mind. He idolizes Tony Stark to some extent. It's not like as much as someone like Peter Parker in the MCU. And most importantly, his constant experience with bullying is a main reason as to why he eventually becomes Kang the Conqueror. The whole reason Kang tells Iron Lad that he is the young Nathaniel Richards who will become Kang the Conqueror is because he was stopping a bully's knife attack that would have left him hospitalized for 3 years, which made Kang kind of have a twisted sense of justice and evil to that extent. And a craving for power, I guess, is a better way to put it. Even looking at things outside of the context of the MCU, Ty Simpkins, the actor, signed a contract for 3 movies, the first one being Iron Man 3. Avengers Endgame didn't count as it was an optional appearance that he was offered rather than a contract-enforced one. I find it a bit strange that they would cast such a niche and unimportant character in the grand scheme of things for multiple appearances unless they were planning some pretty important thing to do with him. Looking into Vision's death in Infinity War, Vision plays a pretty important part in Iron Lad's backstory. He essentially becomes a living mind inside of the Iron Lad suit after dying during the events of Avengers Disassembled. Vision having direct ties to Tony Stark that he doesn't have in the comics would only make it easier for Harley to get to the Vision AI. But he's also one of the few characters who would be smart enough to develop a way to integrate it into a suit. The final note I would like to bring up on this topic of Harley Keener as Iron Lad is the effect it would have on Kang the Conqueror. It is not unprecedented for the MCU to change elements of a character to better fit the story. Let's say in this version of a new Avengers movie, where Harley was Iron Lad, maybe Kang wouldn't be the future version of Harley, as he's Nathaniel Richards, obviously, but rather there was some other personal connection, like Kang being a future descendant of Harley and some member of the Richards bloodline along the way. If you really wanted to tie the movie back to being about Tony Stark, which I hope they don't do too much, you could even have it be that Kang comes back in time to kill a young Harley Keener who is essentially a prodigy of Tony Stark, so he can take his suit with the Vision AI in it and use it to help expand his reign by increasing the power of his weapons or something like that. There are ways that they can work around Harley Keener being Iron Lad, which I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Regardless of how Kang is done, I do feel like there is a really good chance that we could see Harley Keener form the Young Avengers in an eventual movie or TV show under the nickname of Iron Lad. This video ended up being a bit longer than I planned on it being, but there's a few things I didn't even get to mention. First of all, Kang, since he is a time traveler, he could potentially bring back characters who died in the past. So let's say, hypothetically, we want to bring back Quicksilver, because we want to do Inhumans in the movies or something. All we have to do, he goes back in time, gets Quicksilver, and somehow he integrates into the plans or something. I don't think that they're going to bring back Quicksilver. That was just an example I had. And if they want to do the interdimensional traveler route, they could even go so far as to have it be that Kang takes characters from the TV shows and puts them in the main Marvel universe. I do think that it's possible we could get a Shadowlands movie after Shang-Chi, and we could have characters like Daredevil and Luke Cage be in it. There's just a lot of possibility for the future because Kang is opening up all these doors throughout time in the future. The biggest thing of all, however, and I didn't even realize this until post-writing the script, so this is unscripted. So let's just look at if they do Kang as the interdimensional traveler as well. I mentioned it earlier, but, what if? That's a pretty big TV show coming in the future. They could, if they wanted to, have the 2-part New Avengers movie be Secret Wars. For those of you who don't know, Secret Wars, I'm referring to the new Secret Wars, the 2015 one. Basically, Doctor Doom, the multiverse is dying, so Doctor Doom puts together this new world with the broken pieces of all the old multiverses. It's like the last universe, essentially. and he rules over this place as its god. Now, there's characters from Marvel Zombies, the Age of Apocalypse, the Old Man Logan universe, there's Maestro Hulk, Mr. Sinister. There's just so many characters, and I feel like the only way we could really get a Secret Wars movie is if there was a character. Kang is the only other character I could see being the cause of Secret Wars other than Doctor Doom, who I really hope they just don't make a throwaway villain in Fantastic Four 1. At the end of the day, I am glad that they chose someone as awesome as Kang to be the next big bad. He's definitely a villain that I don't feel gets the attention he deserves. My only fear with this whole thing is that he'll suffer from Thanos syndrome, where he becomes extremely overutilized once the MCU popularizes him, making him the only character that they use. So, after Infinity War came out, he was the main villain of Ultimate Alliance 3. There's other examples. I have a list. I'll get into it in a later video at some point. Regardless of the outcome, I'm sure he'll be done justice. Kang is awesome. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.